pushing back the barriers of scientific ignorance. I love it.
Gross.
I know a cat that really, really likes asparagus.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Which is really bizarre.
Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is as confused and bewildered and lost and completely dumbfounded by that latest health study as I am by having to spend eight full hours without my phone.
Wait a minute.
So
wait a minute.
before
And you're in London too, so you're driving on the wrong side of the road and everything.
Oh no, that makes it even worse. So before break, I had to get my phone battery fixed, and I was without my phone for 8 hours. Don saw me wandering around the office completely lost. It was perhaps the worst 8 hours I have spent.
Yeah, you were like in a cold sweat bumping into walls.
It was really bad. Anyway, I am Matt Fox from the Departments of Epidemiology and Global Health, and I am here as always with Chris Gill and Don Thea from the Departments of Global Health at the Boston University School of Public Health.
Happy 2019, Matthew.
And welcome to the new year, as Chris says. For those of you who don't know, I thought I would let you know that I have actually relocated to a new country, as Chris alluded to. I am in England
I think it's actually, Matt, a very old country. I don't think that England was just created.
That is a fair point. It's quite a bit old, but it's new to me. New to me. I'm here for the semester on sabbatical. And in the process of moving, I have come to realize that you need more adapters for every single device that you have to live in this place to solve all of the connection problems I have. And I found the solution to this problem, which is you go to the Population Health Exchange website. Now, they don't actually sell adapters, but they're going to help you adapt to the new world of public health. They've got yeah, I know. That was for you, Don.
Stretching it.
They've got all kinds of lifelong learning tools, programs, and classes. I would go and check it out at www.pophealthex.org. Go there and you can find this podcast as well as many other population health learning programs and tools. And always a reminder, if you could give us a rating on iTunes or Stitcher or whatever you kids are using to listen to this podcast. And now on to the show. So today, in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to look at a study about the effect of an antibody on Alzheimer's disease and whether this is actually a game changer for Alzheimer's treatment. Then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive segment, we're going to talk about a study, a report that I should say that came out on conflict of interest in medical research. And then in our third segment, which is our amazing and amusing, we will get into some things that make us laugh out loud or just help me get through the move to a new continent. So let's get into it. So segment one.
England is not a continent.
What's that?
Technically, England is not a continent.
Well,
it is soon not to be part of the European Union either, apparently.
Well, that is a fair point. But for me, I'm going to say it's a continent. That gets us to the whole question of how many continents there are in the world. And apparently, depending on where you live, you have a different number of continents you believe there are. So how many do you think there are?
I don't know. It's like the same number of its continental breakfasts.
I believe there are 7 continents, but I've been told here that North America and South America are one continent.
I'm not going to vote because I'm incontinent.
Oh. Okay, anyway. So the study that we're looking at, which
Don's
was
having
trying
trouble
to
because his diesel wouldn't start this morning.
which was using an antibody to fight Alzheimer's disease. The study was published in Nature in 2016, so it's not entirely new, but it's close enough. It was by first author Jeff Sevigny of Biogen, which is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The study was titled the antibody, how do I pronounce it?
Aducanumab.
Aducanumab reduces alpha beta plaques in Alzheimer's disease. Did I just totally ruin that?
No.
That's good.
Yeah.
You want to? I did my best.
Aducanumab.
Yeah. Any
Aducanumab.
Any product that ends in mab means monoclonal antibody.
Monoclonal
antibody.
Okay, so as always, here are some of the headlines. Borrowing from cancer's playbook to find a treatment for Alzheimer's disease, says CNN. Trying to solve the Alzheimer's puzzle, says the Washington Post. New drug shows promise in reducing abnormal brain proteins linked to Alzheimer's, says Fox News. And Fortune says Biogen drug study shows early promise against Alzheimer's disease. So Don, let me start by asking you to describe for us what this study was and what they found.
Sure. One of the things I like about doing this podcast is that I get a chance to learn about stuff that I don't ordinarily know about. And
yeah,
this
me too.
This is actually one of them. So let me see if I can give a little bit of background in terms of what the study was trying to address. And it leads into the underlying cause of Alzheimer's disease. And it's not really known what causes Alzheimer's disease. I learned that there's a tremendous amount of controversy over the subject, although there's really one main hypothesis, and I think it's being more and more borne out as being the underlying cause of what causes Alzheimer's disease. And that is that there are these proteins in the brain that get produced by enzymes into these things called alpha-beta proteins. And they're basically small proteins that are in the brain that appear to either themselves, when they're in a high enough concentration, disrupt the electrical signals that go across synapses, or they seem to fold and aggregate and then crystallize and then form these plaques in the brain, which is really the way this disease is diagnosed. And there are some people who think that, in fact, in the same way that prions can produce disease in brains, these AB proteins can, from one seed AB protein, propagate through the brain and then produce these ever-growing plaques. And it seems to be a process that occurs over about 20 years. And then as we get into our 50s, 60s, and 70s, if we're so inclined genetically, or if we're unlucky enough to have these particular kinds of enzymes, we begin to develop the manifestations of Alzheimer's disease. And it's a whole spectrum of diseases, of manifestations that culminate in very, very severe dementia. One of the other interesting things that I found out about this was that I didn't realize it, but people with Down syndrome have a much higher likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease at an earlier stage and at a much higher rate. There's also a genetic predisposition separate from Down syndrome where people are autosomal dominant for the gene that produces this particular protein, and they get Alzheimer's disease typically in their 30s, and it occurs with a very high penetrance. So there's been a number of potential treatment approaches. One is to block these enzymes that take this protein called a preprotein, which is cleaved to produce the AB protein, which is really the offending agent.
This is the amyloid precursor protein,
Amyloid
right?
precursor protein, PPP, right? Precursor.
Right, APP. Yep.
APP. So the one approach would be to block enzymes that break that protein down, therefore lower the amount of this AB protein that's floating around in the brain. There are vaccines that have been postulated that can actually do that through active immunization or passive immunization, where there's a monoclonal, there's an antibody that is introduced that will actually attach to these AB proteins and sort of not immobilize them, but they'll neutralize them, and they'll make them available for the macrophages in the brain, microglia, to sort of chew them up and get rid of them. There are also some other anti-aggregation agents, but much of this work has been done in animal models because nobody has really gotten the science far enough along to be able to actually test these in humans, except for this one product that we're going to talk about in this paper, aducanumab, which is a monoclonal antibody that was directed by screening through a whole bunch of panels of B cells, which are the cells that produce antibodies, and finding those that have been programmed to react to this particular AB protein. They took those B cells, they grew them up, they produced these monoclonal antibodies from these B cells, and they tested them in a mouse model, and they seemed to be able to show that there were lots and lots of benefits in terms of reduction of these plaques.
In mice, yeah.
In mice. And so they've taken this into the clinic, and that's what this paper is about. So this is a double-blind randomized controlled trial in patients with early onset Alzheimer's disease, what they call prodromal or mild Alzheimer's disease, as defined by certain testing with a PET scanner. And so it's a phase 1B RCT, which is intended to determine safety and tolerability and the pharmacokinetics. So the authors say up front that this is not powered to look for a clinical benefit, But what they were looking for was, as I said, safety, pharmacokinetics, and tolerability. So they identified 165 patients at 33 sites who had prodromal or mild Alzheimer's disease, and they gave them monthly intravenous doses of this antibody at increasing concentrations every month for a year. So the concentrations were 1, 3, 6, or 10 milligrams per kilogram. 140 individuals who were enrolled into the study completed the study, and 40 dropped out, mostly due to adverse events. That was about 25% had adverse events among the placebo group, and then there were 23, 19, and up to 38% had adverse events in the group that got drug, depending upon how much drug they got. The baseline was pretty much well balanced across arms and doses. And the idea was to look at these PET scans after 6 months, and then after 12 months also do cognitive testing to see if there had been any improvement in both the anatomical picture through the PET scans of the abnormalities in the brain, as well as their cognitive scores on these tests looking for evidence of dementia. So as far as the results were concerned, I got to say, I thought the results were pretty remarkable in terms of the effect. I think it probably even surprised the authors. They point to figure 1, which obviously we can't display to the listener, but it was a series of brain scans that had different colors at various points along the year-long period. And they show in the placebo group these red splotches in the brain scan, which indicate abnormality, which were there at a fairly high degree at baseline and then continued to be there for the entire duration of the follow-up period. And in comparison to the active drug group, there was a remarkable improvement in these PET scans. It's just unequivocal. And they had specific measures in terms of not only the image, but certain things that PET scans measure that I just don't understand, but they saw a quite significant and dose-dependent improvement in these PET scan measurements that are sort of compatible with what you're seeing on the figure. And those were seen within 6 months, and they continued to improve over 12 months, which is really pretty remarkable if you think about it, the fact that these people probably had been developing these lesions in the brain for at least 20 years. But I think the more interesting thing was that they were able to see that there was substantial improvement in the testing, the sort of the cognitive testing that they did on these individuals at the 24-month period. And I don't want to get into the actual tools that they use, but it was essentially a kind of a global function or a global measure of the individual's function, like can they keep up, can they...
A dementia scale, essentially.
One was a dementia scale, but the other one was you actually ask the individual as well as ask their caretaker, are they able to take care of themselves? Are they keeping a tidy household? Are they remembering things? So it's not just memory, it's really sort of your executive functioning. And they all improved to a pretty remarkable degree.
And this is the first therapeutic study to have shown this.
Right.
There have
been several others that have been equivocal for various reasons that the authors point to. But this was one where it was a product that was both shown in a laboratory setting, but was also shown to cross the blood-brain barrier easily, so it was very accessible to these lesions. And as far as safety was concerned, there were adverse events, and there were some sort of more severe adverse events, but they weren't so severe as I believe for anybody to be hospitalized.
No, but quite a number of the participants had to withdraw because of these adverse events.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It was a substantial number. Yeah.
It was limiting on the product, but
and those events were what they call amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, but they're associated in essence with the disease process being interrupted and there being a little bit of inflammation, a little bit of brain swelling, producing headaches and vomiting, so not insignificant side effects, but and that may well limit the applicability of this particular approach, but it shows, in my opinion, shows great promise.
Right. It was also quite interesting that most of those inflammatory responses, which is basically one assumes that the antibody is inducing an inflammatory response around these beta amyloid plaques, and that's what's causing this edema, this brain edema, which is not nothing. This is a serious limiting side effect, but most of those occurred very early in the treatment protocol and then resolved self-resolved,
Right.
implying that the antibody triggered this inflammatory response, presumably coincident with tagging of these beta amyloid plaques and these oligomers, and then the microglia, these brain macrophages, which will basically come in and
Clean everything up.
eat up these tagged plaques and take them away, and after that, the inflammation resided. So, one wonders that if this went into practice, whether you can, to some degree, mitigate that by a slow dose escalation.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chris, keep going with that, because tell me about your take on this study. Was this a study that you think that we can put a lot of weight into, or were there concerns that you had? And in particular, can I just ask you, because I know you've got a lot of experience with clinical trials, can you just talk us through a little bit this was a phase
1B.
1B. Can you talk us through a little bit those phases?
I wish you hadn't asked me that. My students often ask me, what is the difference between phase 1A and phase 1B? And actually,
just give us the big picture, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Sure. I mean, the general paradigm is that phase 1 studies are really focused on macro safety events. And what I mean by that is, typically with a phase 1 study, you will enroll a very small cohort of maybe a dozen or less individuals. This obviously was a little bit bigger, hence this is a phase 1B, where they're sort of moving towards looking at efficacy. But most phase 1 studies are quite small. They can be 10 individuals. And, in drug studies, what you're often trying to do is to push the dose as far as you can until you start to trigger some sort of limiting side effects. And the purpose is really to look at tolerability rather than to look at efficacy, because the sample size is obviously so small. Mm-hmm. What one can learn from a phase 1 study is pretty limited, because that you're not looking to see does it work? Does it work? Does it cure the disease or treat the disease that you're interested in? You're really looking to see does it do something horrible that would make this like a non-starter as a therapeutic?
And what's the optimal dose?
And what's the optimal dose, right? How far can you go on this? And so they've done a slightly larger study, which is actually including clinical endpoints, and that I think is what makes this a phase 1B. Phase 2 studies are now sort of looking at much larger sample sizes. You could be looking at a couple hundred individuals typically, and now you're looking at preliminary evidence of efficacy. You're looking at different dosing strategies, different, not just like how many milligrams of the product or the nanograms of the product, but like at what schedule. Are you going to give it twice a day, 3 times a day, 4 times a day, once a week? Those sort of practical questions, and also starting to look at the performance of the product in different populations. Here, for example, they looked at very early stage Alzheimer's disease, but a phase 2 study might well look at, well, what about patients who have established Alzheimer's disease? Could you achieve some sort of, recovery of mental function in a patient who already has advanced dementia? So that would be the kind of question that you would start to ask in phase 2. And these phase 2 studies are in a way sort of testing the range of hypotheses about how the drug could be used in clinical practice. And then once you feel like you have a sort of a consolidated answer about where the drug would typically be used and what main target population, then you would go on to phase 3 trials through a series of negotiations with your regulator, in this case it would probably be the FDA, to decide what would the confirmatory large-scale safety and efficacy studies look like. And those would typically involve several thousand subjects and be based around a hard endpoint such as function or like ability to do well on an exam, or in this case it could also include normalization of PET scans. So I mean it could be many different things.
Well, I think the authors alluded to that, and they seem to indicate that is not always necessarily going to be the outcome that you want, because there are people who have very abnormal PET scans who have no dementia whatsoever.
Absolutely.
And vice versa. Absolutely.
So the PET scan is a surrogate marker of the presence of amyloid beta plaques in the brain, but it is not synonymous with Alzheimer's disease per se.
So part of the reason they do phase 2 trials is in part because my understanding was that in part because they're much cheaper to do than a full-on phase 3 study where you have much higher numbers. But you're saying that it's also to allow them to kind of refine the target population and the target circumstances for the intended intervention.
That's correct. And it's not necessarily that you're locked into one target population, but when a company is looking to license a new product, they're going to have to come up with what is the primary indication, which means what is the group for which you have generated your data. that you can then present to your regulator and say, we are offering this product for patients with mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, aged between, 15 years and 99 years, or something like that.
Yep.
And that, given as a treatment on a monthly basis at a following dose range. And that would be your indication. So the entire sort of body of evidence that you're presenting in that dossier for the purposes of licensure is to support that like one sentence pithy statement.
Indication,
right. But then you would presumably go on and look at other indications.
So you got phase 1, 2, and 3. There's a phase 4. We don't need to get into that. But so you said phase 1, we're not looking at efficacy, but they are here. And so what's going on?
Well, just because phase 1 studies are not intended to provide definitive evidence of efficacy does not mean that you're not going to collect efficacy data in the hopes that something pops up. And I think that was the case here, that they did all these mental status exams hoping that they could see a change in function, not just a normalization of a PET scan. And I think you said it well, Don. They must have been delighted to see these results.
Yeah, especially since it was not powered to show that.
Right.
Yeah. Does the fact that the study wasn't powered and wasn't designed to answer that question, does that change your the way that you interpret the results at all?
Oh, certainly. I mean, I don't think that anyone would look at this and say this is definitive evidence that aducanumab is the solution to Alzheimer's disease. I think what you could say is, my goodness, these are provocative and encouraging results, and boy, do we ever need an advanced phase 2 or phase 3 study to confirm it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, my take on this is the fact that these studies were not designed to answer this question doesn't mean that we ignore the really compelling data that they've generated, but it does sort of put it in a little bit of a context that the study wasn't designed to answer this question, and this is what we found. That's really encouraging, but you would need more before you would say, okay, this is the solution to a particular problem.
Right.
So, Chris, give us your critique.
Well, if to sort of recap the history of Alzheimer's research in regards to the pathogenesis of the disease, when the disease was originally described, there were these two pathological findings on autopsy. The one was the extracellular beta amyloid plaques, which are the target of the aducanumab drug here.
Right, not the tau protein.
Not the tau protein. And then the second one is the presence of these intracellular neurofibrillary tangles made of this stuff called tau. And so the literature has sort of long debated, is it the amyloid plaques that lead to Alzheimer's disease, or is it the tau proteins that lead to Alzheimer's disease, or is it both? And at least from the mouse data, and now supported by these data, one could argue that it is the amyloid, but perhaps it's the tau protein that is the effector. That is to say, the amyloid sort of sets up a cascade of events that culminates in these intracellular tau protein plaques.
Or true unrelated.
Or true unrelated, but that, there is sort of like a stepwise progression. And there's some data from that review article that we looked at that talks about these transgenic mice who cannot produce tau, and so they do create beta amyloid plaques, but they don't become demented.
Right.
And you can also trigger tau downstream without needing amyloid plaques to lead to the creation of the neurofibrillary tau protein tangles. And you can therefore create Alzheimer's disease in the absence of beta amyloid plaques. And so it is very plausible that you're looking at a stepwise, the beta amyloid plaques are the upstream event, and then downstream you have all these subsequent events. And that would be very helpful in understanding why it is that so many patients, when they're looked at in autopsy studies, show that they have beta amyloid plaques in their brains, but show no symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Because it's not just the amyloid plaques. It could be that there's a multi-step process leading to this disease. So I thought these data really were helpful because the aducanumab antibody only interdicts the beta amyloid plaque, and yet led to, apparently, we should, again, always temper this, but apparently led to a normalization or an improvement on clinical performance, indicating that either the process of dementing was arrested or slightly receded. And so that would definitely say, it's the weight of evidence is now shifting towards the supposition that it is the beta amyloid plaques that are initiating this process. Even if that is by itself insufficient to lead to Alzheimer's disease, it is necessary in most cases to result in Alzheimer's disease.
So it sounds like both of you are pretty positive on the study, as was I. But I'm curious, any concerns, any things that stuck out to you as things that would potentially reduce your enthusiasm for the results?
Well, the ARIA, the vasogenic edema, the amyloid-related imaging abnormality hyphen edema, does sound like a bit of a buzzkill here. I mean,
can you say more about what that means?
Yeah, so it's triggering an inflammatory response in your brain, and that's going to cause symptoms like headache and wobbly gait and confusion, and potentially could be much worse. In this case, all the patients who developed this outcome basically either withdrew from the study and then recovered, or were able to resume dosing after some time, and the symptoms eventually resolved over time.
Yeah, that was one of the problems that I had, that those individuals who developed this had to be tracked more frequently, and I think their status had to be unblinded. So there was some chance that these results were an effect of that small group of individuals who developed this adverse event being unblinded. And the authors own up to that, but I think that's a potential threat to the validity. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting and was compelling about these data was that there really is a dose-response effect.
Yeah, that was so persuasive.
It's very persuasive that with the increasing doses, you saw a more beneficial effect in all of the parameters that they measured, and there was an effect over time. So there was an improvement over time and an improvement over dose. And to me, those are really compelling aspects to the story.
Yeah, so one of the things we really never talked about in this program before are the Hill criteria, the Bradford Hill criteria for causality.
Explain those to us, Matt.
Yeah, so these were list of criteria around when you try to determine a cause and effect relationship, developed by Sir Austin Bradford Hill, the English statistician back in the 1960s around the whole cigarette and lung cancer issue. Now, in this case, we're dealing with experimental evidence. He was dealing with the case of observational studies, where obviously it's harder to tell cause and effect. And he came up with this list of 9. They were not meant to be like, this is the checklist for when you have causation, but they were sort of a set of guidelines that he came up with. And they have been very, very well critiqued, and I won't go through the critique of them. Modern Epidemiology has a really nice critique of them, and I share a lot of concerns, but there were a few things that are in there. He had these 9 criteria: strength, consistency, specificity, temporality, biologic gradient, plausibility, coherence, experiment, and analogy. I don't love the criteria, but there are certain ones of them that are interesting to me. Obviously, temporality, exposure must come before the outcome if it's going to cause the outcome. But the 2 that I think that may be of relevance here are strength and biologic gradient, dose response. So the idea being that there would be, it's more evidence for a causal relationship if the increase in the dose of the exposure increases the risk of the outcome, and the stronger the effect is, the more likely it is to be causal. Now, you can debunk both of those. You can have you can show very easily that you can have very strong confounded relationships and dose response relationships that come about from various things such as misclassification. But I think in general, when I see things like dose response, it certainly increases my willingness to believe it a little bit. But I often wonder, though, when I see smaller studies with a perfect dose response gradient like you see in this study, it almost feels sort of like too perfect to me. And I just wonder about that. I mean, maybe it's just me, but every study that I look at, the dose response relationships are never perfect.
Yeah.
Now I'm dealing with something, things that are probably less likely to be as perfect as something like this, but it does cause some caution for me. I don't know.
Again, it's a pity we can't throw the PowerPoint slide in front of our listeners here, but there are these 2 graphs that are sort of the mirror image of each other. The first being the change in the PET scan score. And so you go from the left with a placebo, compared with baseline, there is no change in the PET scan score. And then at the 1, 3, 6, and 10 milligram per kilogram per month doses of aducanumab, you see a significant dose-dependent decrease in the PET scan scores, indicating that the PET scans are normalizing. And then in reverse, you see the CDR-SB. This is the Clinical Dementia R rating scale. Sum of boxes, and I'm not exactly sure what that is, but it shows kind of the mirror image of the PET scan scores in terms of the improvement on the dementia scale. And so there is this sort of biological relationship between the intensity of the signal of the beta amyloid plaque present on the PET scan, inversely associated with the performance on the mini mental status exam and the CDR. And that I thought was just really powerful. But I agree, it is a mighty pretty picture, and I wish I could get my studies to look so pretty.
Especially with all those nice colors.
Yeah, and such pretty colors.
And so as we start to wrap up, just one more thing. I mean, do we have any, and I don't know that anybody of the three of us can really answer this question, but do we have any reason to believe these are meaningful changes? In other words, they're impressive changes mathematically, but do we know that these are actually meaningful changes?
I don't think the three of us do, because I don't think we have enough familiarity with the tools and the tests to be able to say that they are meaningful. But they certainly do seem to be trending in the right direction.
Absolutely, and I think this is really interesting evidence. I would just sort of end with just a couple of concerns that I had, which is, Don, you mentioned that the groups were reasonably well balanced, but they were not perfectly balanced in a way that there were some things in terms of the randomized groups that concerned me a little bit. I'm not sure it's enough that it would matter, but it did stick out to me. But the thing that really did concern me, I suppose there were two things. Number one was the fact that you're dealing with a small sample size and you've got 25% attrition, and the attrition seemed to be related to the drug itself, although I'm not totally, or related to severe side effects, whether they be from the illness itself or the drug. But when you're losing 25% of your sample, it's a little hard to say, despite the fact that it was pretty well balanced between the groups. And then the other thing is, and this is a question for you all, I mean, is it inappropriate for me to throw in an extra level of skepticism knowing that this was funded by the drug company that produced the drug?
Of course.
Yeah, but I think I think that the authors put that out there in the third paragraph of the introduction in a way that I hadn't seen in quite a while, where they delineated exactly what the roles of the people who were employees of the company and what was the role of the non-employees, and they had an independent DSMB and they had independent evaluators. I think that they did a very good job of transparency, and I think that there is a role for the pharmaceutical industry in taking molecules like this to the clinic and actually establishing efficacy. It's not something that that academics or the academy is ever going to do, or the NIH is really ever going to do in large amounts. So I think
no question.
It's a proper role.
Yeah.
No, I agree completely. My only point being, is it fair that I set the bar a bit higher when I know that it's been funded by a drug company? I think it is fair. And I think it's all about reproducibility, as we have talked about many times before. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon the research community to find another group that's not Biogen, that's not these guys, to do a similar study and come up with the same kind of beautiful reproducible results. And then I think it gets to be even more compelling.
It's the Steely Dan rule. You got to go back, Jack, and do it again.
So Chris, you wanna have the last word?
Such as it is, I'm so encouraged by the direction that this research is going. We talked about this in a previous episode, the one we were talking about herpes simplex and Alzheimer's disease, and one of the twin weights around the neck of the Alzheimer's research field has been the difficulty in being able to identify in vivo whether beta amyloid plaques are present or not. And so the PET scan has just revolutionized this. Now that they suddenly have a true and quantifiable biomarker that can be captured in real time and repeatedly.
In living individuals
is such a huge advance. And with Alzheimer's research, it's very hard to know that you're really studying Alzheimer's disease versus Alzheimer's disease plus vascular dementia or Parkinson's disease. And it's like these conditions
Lewy body.
overlap to such a huge extent. And this has sent us down so many rabbit holes in the research in terms of should we be treating Alzheimer's disease with anti-inflammatories or with cardiovascular modifying drugs? But that's because probably we're actually treating the non-Alzheimer's dementia and treating the vascular dementia. And it's all confounded. But now with a PET scan, we have a much better tool for studying this. And I think the biological plausibility of the plaque hypothesis and the beta amyloid hypothesis and the specificity of this antibody is really persuasive that we are, whether this is the final answer, I doubt, but I think we are now on the right track. And I would not be surprised if within 10 or 20 years we actually had practical, treatments for Alzheimer's disease that were based on the true biology of the disease. So cross your fingers.
All right. Well, with that, let's move on to our second segment. So in our second segment, we want to talk about an article that was published in the New York Times. It was entitled "What These Medical Journals Don't Reveal: Top Doctors' Ties to Industry" by Charles Ornstein and Katie Thomas. It was reporting by both the New York Times and ProPublica, and it was an analysis, to the best of my ability to describe it, was an analysis of lack of reporting drug industry ties and drug industry funding in published medical research. And it goes through a series of issues that have arisen with high profile incidents of researchers not declaring large amounts of money that they have received from drug companies. So in particular, there was a high-profile case that related to one particular researcher who had received about over $100,000, not directly to him, my understanding is, but to his employer. So essentially funding for which he had not declared this when publishing his research. And so it re-raises an issue that we've been talking about many times on this podcast, which is, the conflicts of interests that people have when they take funding from drug companies and how that potentially could skew both the research findings and the way that those findings are interpreted and packaged and sold in a research publication. And Don, we ended the last segment, and I had asked the question, and thinking of the particular last study that we were looking at around the amyloid plaques, whether I should set the bar higher because this was a drug company study. Well, now we're in the case where it isn't a drug company study; it's an independent organization, an academic institution who is receiving drug company funds, but then either not declaring it, or I suppose even in the cases where one does declare it, it has the potential to affect, the conduct of the research and the ability to report that information accurately. So I guess my question to you both is there anything new here? Did we learn anything from this investigative piece that we didn't already know? And if so, what are the lessons that we should be taking away from this?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I took away from the article was that there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity in this whole area. And I found myself thinking, well, I'm on a DSMB and I've taken some money from a drug company being on a DSMB for that particular activity. Or there was a research project that was funded by Novartis that I was involved in, and it had nothing to do with a product necessarily of Novartis, but should I be declaring that? And I'm on the IRB, and we wrestle with this also, and sort of the threshold amount of money that is considered to be corrupting is $5,000. And, if it's less than $5,000, then it's not considered to be something that would sway your opinion. Whereas if it's over $5,000, and therefore you don't need to declare it, if it's over $5,000, you do need to declare it.
I am totally willing to be considered for much less than $5,000.
And is that $5,000 a year? Is that $5,000?
I think it's in a year. I think it's in a year, but I'm not positive about that.
Sure.
But the thing that came across to me was that it's a difficult situation because there's so much ambiguity, and I think that the researchers truly don't know what to do and don't know how forthcoming they need to be. I didn't get the impression that there was a tremendous amount of malfeasance among the people that they outlined for this study, but because of the confusion, they got kind of caught with their pants down, and it can be a very, very damaging thing for an academic career. So I think, the journals need to get it right, and the institutions need to get it right, and all the trade organizations need to get it right.
I agree with you. I think it gets to the question of whose responsibility is this? clearly there's no way for a journal to know that you've received drug company fund, or there's no easy way, I should say, for a journal to know that you've received drug company funding if you don't declare it. Whether the journal's policy is the same as, say, you just described the policy at Boston University, but whether the journal's policy is the same as the university's policy at $5,000, I'm not sure that's true for all journals, and it can get very confusing. I have also I've done a training course for a drug company in which I was paid for that. Do I have to declare that? Now, it wasn't over the $5,000, and I don't see how it in any way would relate to anything that I might be studying, because I don't study anything that is related to any product. But it does strike me as unclear, despite the efforts to clarify this over the years. Chris, what's your sense? Where's the line?
Oh, I don't think there is a line, but it is. I don't know. I didn't feel quite as forgiving, I think, about these three cases that were in the New York Times article as the two of you, because in the argument that the money had gone to the institution is just another way of saying that this was a grant money. So, like, when I get money from the NIH, it doesn't come to me. It doesn't go into my wallet. It goes to Boston University, but I have almost complete control over that money. So if you get a $100,000 grant from, company X to do research on company X's product, that seems to me exactly the kind of thing that should raise red flags about conflicts of interest, because it means that you do not have an unbiased view necessarily of the outcomes of your study. And that is what we're really worried about, is whether there's misrepresentation.
But the money you get from the NIH that goes to Boston University that you have complete control over, you don't really, because there are layers of oversight. So you can't take that money and pay the rent on a vacation home.
Right, but I'm certainly going to put it on my paper that this research was funded by the NIH through this grant.
Well, you're obligated to.
Right, but even if I wasn't, I would say that, because I think it's relevant. And whereas one of the individuals here was slapped on the wrist for precisely not doing that, of mentioning that he had written this paper about this product based on funds that came from the drug that made the product, and he didn't mention that. That seems to me that it completely crosses whatever line there is. I sympathize with your argument entirely about the DSMBs. I sit on two DSMBs, and I'm wondering, like, oh my God, should I have been fessing up to that? But the conflict of interest is fundamentally different, because when you're sitting on a DSMB, you're volunteering your time as a civic duty to protect the safety of a group of participants in a trial who you don't know. But that's why you're there.
But you're also getting paid for it.
Yeah, but you're not doing. You have no stake in the outcome of the trial. Like, if the drug succeeds or fails, sitting on the DSMB, I don't really care, right? What I want to know is how many patients in group X had the side effect versus group Y. That's what I'm there looking at. And in a sense, the product itself is almost immaterial, because really we're focused on the safety and protection of the subjects.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I completely agree.
I'm not sure I do either.
Because if in fact you're getting paid for that particular activity by the company that's running the trial, you may be very subtly persuaded to think that a particular finding or outcome that you are impaneled to determine the relevance of would shade in favor of the company. I mean, I can see that as happening.
Isn't there a lot of research that since the bans have been put in place on these big expensive junkets that drug companies would take doctors on to get them to sit to prescribe their drugs, that actually just offering a free lunch will often be enough to get a doctor to prescribe something, that we are often influenced by these small amounts of money. So I don't know what the right answer is, but it does strike me as it's just not clear how much money would influence somebody, and where it also isn't clear to me that declaring it, well, obviously that's all for the good, that declaring it solves the problem.
Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe the better part of valor is for us to simply declare that we sit on DSMBs for these companies. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's any harm in doing so. It seems like it's unnecessary, but it's probably the better thing to do in the future, and I guess I will do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's probably it. All right,
this is where it's going.
We have talked about this topic many times before, so I don't want to take it too far. I just wanted to sort of think about whether or not there was anything new in here, and I do want to continue to to read about and think about this
However,
issue, because
I will go on record as saying that my declaring that I give my time to be on 2 DSMBs to protect the subject's safety is not the same as why did this guy not declare on 50 publications, including the New England Journal, that he had received all this money from the drug company that he was writing papers about.
I absolutely agree with you that it's not the same.
We are changing our behavior, to be uber conscious, but the crime is not being on a DSMB. It is taking money and not declaring it.
It can be very egregious.
Yeah, and I feel these were.
Yeah.
Yep. And I there's degrees obviously, but I think we want to think carefully about where those lines are, or at least, get better at figuring out ways to remove these conflicts of interest, or come up with ways that we can separate out these processes so that the conflict is not there in the first place. But obviously, so much money is involved that's unlikely to happen. Anyway, so let's move on to our last segment, our favorite, our amazing and amusing segment, where we want to highlight some of the wacky things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. I'll look at the weird and wacky things that happen in our field, as well as those that inspire us. So do you guys mind if I go first this time?
Sure, please do.
So I'm going to read you the abstract of a study. I'm not going to read the title, but you'll figure it out once I get into it. So we all teach to various degrees. I am on a teaching sabbatical this semester, so I'm not actually teaching, but I certainly think a lot about teaching and how we decide who is in fact a good teacher. Those are teaching evaluations. Generally, it's the way that we do this. So I thought this was an interesting study when I came across it. The objectives for this says, results from end-of-course student evaluations of teaching are taken seriously by faculties and form part of a decision based for the recruitment of academic staff, the distribution of funds, and changes to curricula. However, there is some doubt as to whether these evaluation instruments accurately measure the quality of course content. So we investigated whether the provision of chocolate cookies as a content-unrelated intervention influenced teaching results. Oh yeah, so they did a randomized controlled trial
of plus minus chocolate cookies.
Broke third-year medical students up into different groups. Some of which the groups were randomly allocated to get 500 grams of chocolate cookies during an emergency medicine course session, and the remainders did not. They were all taught by the same teachers. And what did they find? They found that a total of 112 students completed the evaluation form, and the cookie group evaluated teachers significally better than the control group.
Bribery works, man.
113 versus 109.
Seriously.
Course material was considered better with the various effect size, and summation scores were better. So the conclusion is the provision of chocolate cookies had a significant effect on course evaluations.
Good to know.
These findings question the validity of evaluations and their use in decision-making. So the title of the article was Availability of Cookies During an Academic Course Session Affects Evaluation of Teaching by Michael Hessler, and it was, I can't even find the journal, Medical Education 2018.
You just
so I
got to
thought
be
that
really
was,
careful.
there's a lesson there to be learned there.
Don't do oatmeal, though, because that'll cost you.
Never do oatmeal. And the worst thing you could ever do is to provide an oatmeal raisin cookie that people see and they think is a chocolate chip cookie, because then they're
so
disappointed.
mad.
All right, Chris, you want to go next?
Yeah, I found this beautiful study, and I wanted to highlight this for our producer, Leslie Talalian, who, as those may know, runs the Population Health Exchange at Boston University. She's the director. Is that right? You're the director. Yes, she's nodding. So Leslie's very interested in digital learning. And I found this really interesting study in my favorite journal, the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science. And the study is called Integration in Emerging Social Networks Explains Academic Failure and Success. Lead author Christoph Stadtfeld from Zurich in Switzerland. And so what these guys did was to take advantage of a natural experiment. There was an engineering degree course that they offered at their university. And unlike most courses where you apply to get in and the entry criteria are very strict, here the entry criteria were fairly loose and they allowed a lot of people in. But in order to continue, you had to pass this very onerous, rigorous exam at the end of year one. And so there was like a lot of attrition, and about half the class is expected to fail to move forwards. For those who succeed, it's very prestigious, and they're academic or professional careers are launched. And for those who fail, it's quite a drubbing. And a lot of them don't even complete their bachelor's degree, and they sort of like drop out of the system. So it's a high risk, high yield, but high penalty gamble that they go through. Now, these students who come to this program come from all around Europe. And so for the most part, they don't know each other. And so they create this sort of cohort of around 230 students at the beginning of each year. And then they go forward and, take their classes and eventually take this exam. And what the researchers wanted to know was what are the things that predict success in this? And particularly whether social networks that the students establish within themselves lead to success. And so at 5 points during this succession, they did these surveys with the students where they asked, name all the other students that you've had a positive interaction with, like, hello, how are you doing? Have a nice day. Oh, I like your T-shirt. Something kind of neutral but friendly. Mm-hmm. And how many people, and naming the ones that they had said that to at multiple points in time. And then also, which members of the group do they become friends with, and which members of the group did they become study buddies with. And then they created all these networks, and they found that the students who had formed these networks of study groups significantly outperformed the ones who sort of remained loners or isolated within the group and didn't actually integrate with the rest of the community. And they challenged this in terms of all sorts of controlled models. What were their GPAs in high school, their financial resources, et cetera, and still the network analysis turned out to be very robust, which is not a very shocking thought that being involved in groups of students who interact and collaborate and share notes and work together and solve problems together would be a particularly good way of learning engineering. Mm-hmm. But the way that they described this and explained it was so powerful. And they actually have if you have time, the listeners can go online and they have a cartoon that shows these networks evolving over time and who fell in and who dropped out in terms of succeeding on the online exam. Now, the reason I think this is so interesting is that we are now moving into this era of online education, where one of the big downsides to online education is that you lose the cohorting and the direct interaction between students over time. And if this research is correct, that there is a penalty to be paid for online do-it-your-own education or master's degrees. And I would love to see this as a stimulus for sort of further discussions within the School of Public Health, because everybody is galloping down this road right now. And
it's certainly the way that many schools
there's a
are
cost
going
to be paid for it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Sure. It's like the hyper-isolation of humanity.
No man is an island.
Yeah.
Turns out.
Really cool. Very interesting. Okay, Don, you're back in cleanup.
All right. You guys have cats?
Yeah.
No.
Jackson cat.
I had one many years ago.
All right. I'm not, as I've referred to before, I'm not a cat owner or
my arms look like a hamburger.
I like cats, though. I'm a cat person.
But my understanding is that cats are very finicky eaters. That they tend to be very, very particular about what they eat, and apparently this for the cat food industry, this is a bit of an issue. And I think finding the right combination of texture and food and taste for a new cat food product has been something that the authors of this paper aptly put has been dogging the industry for many years.
I'm very worried about where this is going.
So I found an article by G.J. Pickering.
Long Pickering and Prober? No, those are the pediatric infectious disease people.
From the Department of Biological Sciences at Brock University, St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada, where they did a study optimizing the sensory characteristics and acceptance of canned cat food by the use of a human taste panel.
What?
No.
That's wrong.
So hold on.
So there.
A study done with former friends.
So the ration. Why did they do it?
Why would people eating cat food tell you anything about whether or not a cat is going to like cat food?
Well, see, no, that's the point. That's the point. Is that apparently this is a very high stakes game. And they need to be able to have a system whereby they can emulate what they think a cat likes. So what they did is they set up a panel of humans, and they broke their evaluation of the two component parts of cat food, meat chunks and gravy gel.
Gross.
And they had these people evaluate 18 flavor attributes
No.
Yeah, so it was sweet, sour, acid, tuna, herbal, spicy, soy, salty, cereal, caramel, chicken, methionine, vegetable, ophaly,
don't know what
meaty,
that is.
burnt flavor, prawn, rancid, and bitter.
And catnippy.
And then 4 texture dimensions: hardness, chewiness, grittiness, and viscosity.
Gross.
So what they did is they impaneled these, I think it was students and staff from the university. There were like 18 of them, and apparently there was a 40% dropout rate initially because the people just were so grossed out of having to eat and evaluate cat food.
That is gross. But now that
super
we're here,
disgusting.
I got to know what they found.
30% prospective panelists opted not to complete the screening exercise or to continue with subsequent sessions, with dislike of cat food products cited as the most common reason for non-competition.
Did they pay these people?
They did not pay these people.
I once tried a
There's
spoonful
no conflict
of
of interest.
of my
They didn't
cat's
even,
food.
They didn't even ask them whether they own cats or not.
It was chunky chicken and cheese. It was absolutely repulsive. That was the last time. That was back in high school.
That is so gross.
So basically, what they came up was a panel of human-based evaluations and characteristics for human panels to test the tastefulness, the post-nasal aroma, apparently,
gross.
of some of these foods, so that now they can bring it into the field and test it against the acceptability with a panel of live cats.
So
My cat's favorite food is
Pushing back the barriers of scientific ignorance. I love it.
my favorite cat's food is my food or the dog's food.
gross.
I know a cat that really, really likes asparagus.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
Which is really bizarre.
I had a cat
cats-
that wouldn't.
cat
I had a cat that
pee smell
wouldn't
different
eat.
after they eat asparagus?
I don't think
gross.
so.
That's an important question to know.
The other thing that I learned is the Latin name for cats and dogs.
Felix and Canis?
No, Felis catus.
Felix Canis and Canis. Canis.
Canis familiaris.
Really?
Yeah.
Not Canis? Dog?
No, Canis familiaris.
Lesson learned. Lesson
Castor
learned.
Acer, Eater
All
Beaver.
right. Well, that
We
is the end of our,
degenerated to yet a new low.
we absolutely have. That is the end of our program. If you got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at PopHealthEX, or you can tweet me at ProfMattFox, or you can tweet Chris at id.gill, or Don at dtheo1, or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthex.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound and editing. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.